to present a hypothetical. What if, in 1984, Nintendo had not set up a licensing program for third-party publishers? Nintendo decides that, like every other console that had preceded them, they would be the only authorized producers of software for their platform. It's one of those things that changes everything. Without Nintendo's example of a successful video game platform that had diverse publishers, there wouldn't be the counterexample to the Atari VCS's flood of software that often gets the blame for the collapse of the video game market in the US. I think the Famicom would likely sputter out after 4 or 5 years, with Nintendo iterating on it until they felt like some other style of toy would get the attention of children. It feels like some open structure, like computers, would take over as the primary gaming platforms. Of course, with Nintendo giving licenses to make software to first Hudson, then Namco, we got the modern model of a video game platform. It cannot be understated just how important the release of Xevious for the Famicom was to shaping Nintendo, the family computer, and the entire video game industry. Nintendo's Mahjong and Golf got the Famicom through its first rough year, and then it was Xevious that got it through years 2 through 11. Of course, this video isn't about that 1984 release. This is about the 1990 re-release of that game. For the Disk System re-release, Namco made 2 changes to Xevious. The first is right here on the title screen. Similar to Pac-Man, which released on the same day, they just updated the copyright date. The other change is much worse, and I will get to it later. The original arcade version of Xevious was a revolution. It was the biggest thing to hit Japanese arcades since Space Invaders. Xevious redefined what shooting games were, essentially becoming the very first shoot-'em-up that we'd recognize in a modern sense, and the entire video game industry would spend the next 4 years in its shadow, with everyone either copying it or responding to it. Of course, that was 1982, and the Famicom version was 1984. In 1990, we're basically at the peak of the shoot-'em-up genre. We're in the time when all of its master developers were producing their greatest shooters. And Xevious in 1990? Well, it's not a bad game. It'll never be a bad game. But this might have been the worst possible moment for a re-release of Xevious. Too old-fashioned and out-of-date for the audience of 1990, and not old enough yet to really be considered a classic that people revisit for the sake of nostalgia. The plot of Xevious is absurdly elaborate, especially for an arcade game where you mash the fire button and watch the ships explode. But to keep it simple, an ancient civilization built a supercomputer called GAMP, and then seeded the stars with this AI. Eventually the AI went crazy and killed all of them, and now thousands of years later, one of the other GAMPs from the planet Xevious has come to Earth, and only one fighter craft can be sent out to stop them. Xevious plays out on an endless scrolling loop. You just go right back to the beginning again with no interruption. There isn't an ending, you just keep going until you run out of lives and see what kind of score you get. You're flying the Solvolo, and it's a fragile thing. Any contact with an enemy or with a bullet sends you crashing. Hitting the B button fires your gun straight ahead to take out aerial targets. There is no auto-fire here, so you might want to break out an auto-fire controller for this one. The A button drops a bomb to hit ground targets, something that most shooters in the years following Xevious would copy. There's plenty of ground targets for your bombs, but the most important place you need it is for hitting the core of the Anorgenesis, one of the first bosses in video games. Confronting the giant flying saucer is the only time that the screen stops scrolling, though after about 15 seconds, if you haven't hit the core, the game continues onward. The bombs are also useful for revealing secrets. There are places on the map that you can bomb for extra lives and additional points. Extra lives are also awarded for reaching certain score thresholds. The Famicom version of Xevious is also one of the progenitors of the cheat code. It's not the very first cheat code, but it's the first one that got a lot of attention. The cheat code allowed players to make some pretty significant changes to how the game played, matching the style of arcade dip switches. The discovery and publication of the code is credited with driving Xevious sales even further, and Namco stripped it out of every subsequent release. Both the NES and Disk System versions of Xevious had it removed, which I guess is a good case for getting the original Famicom cartridge. Another significant innovation in Xevious is the adaptable difficulty. The enemy patterns start out simple, swooping towards you and then breaking away, basically trying to get close to shoot but not collide. And as you progress and score more points without dying, the patterns of the aerial enemies that you encounter become more and more difficult. You'll start being confronted by more dangerous craft, ones that are much more aggressive about how they fire at you, and some that are perfectly willing to just collide with you at high speed. When you get shot down, the game sets the difficulty back a bit, although there's always a baseline difficulty for any given region. And speaking of those regions, Xevious is actually a pretty generous game when it comes to making progress. If you've gone more than 50% of the way through a region and then got shot down, then the game automatically advances you to the next section. It's a way to make the player feel like they're always getting some progress, even when they're not doing that well. In Japan, the original Famicom release of Xevious is held in the same level of esteem as Super Mario Bros. It's that big and that platform defining. The 1990 Disk System re-release? I don't think anybody even noticed it came out. Even Xevious fans had other Xevious games to play at that point. I have some strange feelings about this one, because while Xevious obviously is a classic and a really good game, and historically important, I'm kind of in the same boat as the Japanese players in 1990. I've now played dozens of games that were just copying Xevious. I've seen and experienced an entire industry bent around this game. So I'm kind of at a point where I'm saying, alright, I don't need Xevious right now. Of course, Xevious will be here and waiting when I'm ready.